Good morning, welcome to the faculty seminar. This particular seminar, that is today's, is especially important because it is in a sense a celebration. And we are celebrating the publication of Neethi's book, Globalization Lived Locally, a Labor Geography Perspective. This is also the topic on which she'll be speaking today. And I needn't introduce her, but I might still remind you that she did her MPhil and PhD at the Center of Development Studies under JNU, and she was also a Fulbright doctoral research fellow at the University of Georgia in the United States. She is a labor geographer, and I feel very happy when I think that between the two of them, that is Neethi and Anant, they have a range of disciplines to discuss, right? So Anant is an economist turned sociologist, politics, geography, history. Both of them I know are deeply interested in history as well. So there's a range of social sciences and humanities disciplines which they can talk about. And I'm sure that will be reflected in today's talk. We know from the blurb that has been circulated that she argues that labor becomes actively involved in the very process of globalization and capital expansion, and that she wishes to examine contemporary forms of labor control, conflict, and response under a globalization regime in Kerala through 4 case studies. And I'm sure she'll also speak of women workers. Over to you, Neethi. Welcome, and we are very happy to have this seminar. And many congratulations for the publication.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Anil and Himanshu, for this opportunity. So now coming to my book, actually I was perplexed and confused about where to focus or what to talk about this book in this 45 minutes. Because this is a culmination of my 6 years of research, which also include 3 years of extensive field work. And I have covered 4 case studies, and each one of these cases can easily go on to 45 minutes. So I had to take a call here. Then I have decided that, okay, I'll leave my cases for the readers who are interested, who can go on for the detailed reading. And today for my presentation, I'll be mainly focusing on the background and the framework, and the theoretical framework, especially the major framework of this book, that is the labor geography framework, and the conceptual, some conceptual clarity on this theme as such, and the settings of this book. So, to begin with, this book deploys the labor geography framework to study the contemporary forms of labor control, conflict, and response under globalization regime in Kerala. So this book is basically inspired by a critical reading of the meta-narratives of globalization that suppose the geographically unfettered mobility of capital. This then inspires me to look into another venue of studies on struggles of ordinary people in making the places and spatial relations of life and work, which then provides the rationale for my book. And this is explored through 4 diverse in-depth case studies. So here this case studies does not aim to provide a continuous tale. Rather, I'm trying to provide here display of collage of events and happenings. Now coming to the aims of this book is trying to identify the myriad forms of globalization as against casting it in a single mode, and the necessity to address workers as active social agents rather than passive subject, and to unravel the role played by various seemingly unlikely actors in the globalization narratives as such, including the church and other civil society agents, local self-government bodies, in shaping the globalization processes at local level. So the aim is to reflect on the local discourses of globalization related issues. That is hence the title of this book, Globalization Lived Locally. Regarding the content, so this book starts with a discussion and review of broad conceptual themes And what follows is an account of why Kerala has been chosen as an arena for this inquiry for historical and contemporary reasons. And the main body of this book consists of 4 different cases. So while analyzing Kerala's rendezvous with globalization, this book and its 4 cases visit newly emerging work sites in Kerala. So each one of these cases addresses broad aspects of labor control, conflict, and response in instances with 4 major sectors of Kerala's economy, that is textiles, electronics, food processing, and the port sector. So the context in which these cases is not in terms of the physical location of these cases, but for the worksite specificities. And the order of appearance is also not accidental. That is, the first 3 cases mainly talks about the female workers in informal settings, and the worksite ranging from their home to various clandestine civil society centers, and then to factory floor. And then comes to the male-oriented work site, that is the port. And see, all these cases we see interesting perspectives on how these workspaces have modified in a globalized or liberalized context. Now coming to the first case, the garment sector, or the case of the garment workers, this chapter inquires into the working lives of women garment workers in 2 firms in an export promotion industrial park in southern Kerala, and it examines how these workers organized around a rather local set of concerns and formed their own association. And the second chapter uses the case of prominent electronics manufacturing unit in Kerala, and to illuminate an approach to labor studies which focuses on local labor control regime. So in this case, the church is shown to play an unexpected role in local labor control regime. Now coming to the third case, that focuses on the experience of a group of women workers involved in home-based work for a food processing unit in Kerala. And the last case, that is the 6th chapter, focuses on the case of Cochin Port, and it's about the recent experience in the privatization of Cochin Port, one of India's premier ports. So as globalization and labor is the major thematic pillar, in this book, so this discussion begins with this broader theme, that is the theme of globalization and labor. So the past few decades have witnessed rapid globalization with increasing globally integrated production chains, international trade, investment and capital flows, which hence leads to fading of international boundaries and changes in industrial organization and forms of competition. It is believed that Fordism is dead, and we are in the era of post-Fordist production process and flexible specialization. So all forms of cost of production hence become important, because it implies that there is an easier mobility of capital to those areas where production cost is cheaper. Here production cost mainly into the cost of labor itself is cheaper. So these changes create an entirely different political economic environment for workers around the world, as the labor market has been radically restructured and made more flexible in the face of strong market volatility and heightened competition and narrowing profit margins. So one way of responding to this price competition among suppliers has been to reduce wages, as I had mentioned in the earlier point, reduce wages into race to the bottom. But more significant has been the apparent move away from the regular employment towards increasing reliance upon informal work settings in the form of subcontracting or home-based production, or even using more and more temporary workers in the work arrangement as such. Now, if we look at this, the picture which is portrayed by the meta-narratives of globalization about workers' position, we can see that it's mainly looking at falling union density, disempowerment, or weakening link between unions and democratic parties, diminishing influence on government policies, and so on. So according to mainstream theories, both national government and organized labor are powerless when faced with international marketization or even neoliberal deregulation and global economic integration. So this optimism with regard to labor as an agency of social progress has been replaced by pessimism that sees little prospect for workers acting on their own behalf. And can be seen in literature that while capital is networked, labor remains switched off, or if workers can't develop any transnational connections, they might as well relinquish their struggles at any other scales, particularly at local. So any kind of worker activities at local stages is sort of going to keeping it aside. So this picture rather shows an obsession with seemingly placeless and footloose nature of capital, where sometimes even if workers' activities are only sometimes seen as modifying forces, with capital at the center stage, empirically and theoretically banishing workers to the fringes of discipline. So the notions of emergence of global economy is portrayed as capital's creation, the logical outcome of the explanatory nature of capital, and the new economic and political reality to which labor must respond. Now, these effects are doubly obvious when we look at the transformed role of women in production and labor market. So the new labor market structure not only have facilitated exploitation of labor power of women on part-time basis and substituted lower paid female labor for that of more highly paid and less easily laid off male workers, the revival of subcontracting and domestic or family systems have also permitted a resurgence of patriarchal practices in the labor market. So a preference for women exists as it brings with it a reduced cost of production and reduced probabilities of the threat of organization or unionization. So when women are employed, it's easy to forget about minimal standard of decency and safety at work required by labor laws, or minimum wage laws, and prevention of access to social security is easier. So it is within this hegemonic capacity of patriarchal norm to define women's labor as not only as cheap, but socially and economically less worthy of equitable pay and other conditions. Studies have observed that in some cases it is women's status as unmarried and subordinate daughters that has made them an attractively cheap and flexible pool of labor. And in other contexts, it's their status as wives or even mothers that has justified their lower wages and limited job security. There are even studies which shows how local capital, using its deep knowledge of the local cultural norms about the roles women are made to play and the docility that women are expected to practice in family as well as in production units. Now, since this study is mainly focusing on these women workers in Kerala, let's have a look at this scene. So, Kerala has been a paradox with, on one hand, social development in the state being universally acclaimed as a model for poor states, and other hand, acute unemployment and low labor force participation. So low female work participation despite high education, increasing casualization among female workforce, and women generally occupy in low paid, low status mainly due to limited mobility. As a result, there is high gender disparity in wages. And as far as the decision making goes, decision making regarding whether or not to be part of labor market is something which is taken by either by family or by society. So even uneducated have very strong job preferences based on proximity to home, prestige, class consciousness, and social status. So and now as far as the trade union activities goes, in India, we can see that women's activities in trade unions have not received much attention within mainstream social science. And when mentioned at all, the focus seems to be on their low level of trade union activity. In Kerala's labor movements too, women workers are noted to have played a secondary role compared to their male counterparts, though exceptions have been known to exist. So to conclude, as Anna Lindbergh and other historians have also observed, laboring women have undergone over decades a process of effeminization through which adherence to feminine norms have taken their worker status, taken over their worker status. So thus far we have seen the concerns in literature, the concern in literature about the validity of the potential of labor agency in general. However, a critical reading of these meta-narratives or the mega-narratives points towards 6 key myths. Then the book talks about then these six myths of globalization. So 3 of which are general and the 3 specifically concerned to labor. So the first 3 myths basically talk, we live in borderless world where place matters less and less, and globalization is some irresistible force that stands over and about different places and people, and globalization signals the demise of nation state as such. But now coming to workers, it is even more interesting. Workers are portrayed as hopeless and locally bound and are rendered vulnerable to hypermobile capital. And firms on the other side, which has the capacity, firms which is represented by capital, which is represented by firms, which has the capacity to choose between several possible production sites, ultimately gravitate to places with lower labor cost. So if workers are not to succumb to globalization, then they have no choice but to upscale their actions and institutions to match the translocal forces that undermine their well-being. So as far as the accounts of global restructuring and their negative implications for workers goes, it has been portrayed primarily as political and ideological phenomena, naturalizing capitalism and making it necessary and inevitable. But such a view is problematic because these studies do not problematize or question the claims of a causal link between global economic change and the negative outcome for labor. And they do not attempt to challenge the exclusion of workers as effective social actors. So this is problematic for 2 interconnected reasons. One is that the workers are portrayed not as active participants, but as passive recipients. And the second one is globalization in its multiple varieties are missing, and it is portrayed in a single flavor. So thus, recognizing the role of labor in the process of globalization and opening up the black box of global economy allows us to understand that there are a variety of strands and processes of globalization. So with this background, the book shows the importance or the alternative ways of examining work and employment practices hence emerged relevant. And this study makes a room for geography into the framework of studying work, employment, and society. And this book looks at labor as understood with a geographical approach. So the following discussion then moves into this direction. Now coming to geography in focus. So in recent years, there has been a growing awareness within the field of industrial relation that the contemporary changes taking place in the nature of work in various workplaces are clearly spatially informed and played out in different ways. So what is needed, as those working in this area have argued, is an attention to the spatiality of everyday life, which is essential not only for the analysis of changing geopolitical framework, but also for reflecting on the ways in which people organize their lives, their livelihoods, and struggles against various power structures. So this attempt is further justified by the observation that if industrial relations scholars have spent a great deal of time asking what is industrial relations, until recently they have spent no time asking where these relations have played out and how they are affected by the specific places in which they are played out. So this strand gains further relevance since both workers and capitalists are anchored geographically, not only in their labor market, but also in the households, the community, and the state, all of which have particular spatial forms and geographical relationship to each other. Thus, making a room for geography in industrial relation research more than simply adding to a regional context to the conventional workplace focused studies, and a geographic perspective is useful in specifying the underlying forces behind local variability and uneven development in labor market. So this further allows us to map the complex landscape in which contemporary workers live, work, and struggle. So to analyze labor in a non-geographical way, this book argues, is therefore miss much of what is fundamental to everyday lives of workers in this era of global capitalism. Now, coming to the theoretical tools to ensure the incorporation of geography for the analysis of labor or even labor capital labor relations, two necessary ones are space and place. So here, space in this framework is associated with capital. It is a domain across which capital is constantly searching in pursuit of greater profit, while place is associated with labor, and place as the meaningful situations established by labor. So space again conceptualize capital's opportunistic quest for profitable investment, while place shows laborers' emotional and physical attachment to specific location. So there is no necessary connection of this type. The usage is very common, with space representing global and then modern or abstract, and place standing in for the local, the traditional or the particular. So this transaction between this abstract realm of space and an experience and the felt world of place lie at the center of human geographies, center of human geographers' interest. So it is not simply that the employment relations occur in place, rather it is that the placing of these relations materially affect how they unfold. So now coming to the placing of these relations, it is at this point that this book introduced the importance of local labor market. So the local labor market shows the institutional site at which place and space intersect, and this is hence it requires special mention. So this is a starting point for understanding spatiality of social relations of work, and it inquires into local labor market shows how rich and complex class relations can be. So here, this book shows local labor market not as an outline on map, but as a social space where the unique intersection of processes of labor production, reproduction, and regulation takes place. So it can be seen that much of these concerns have been addressed in the writings of geographers working within the field of labor geography, which is, and this labor geography, this framework is closely associated with the work of Andrew Harrod. And this book hence used the framework of labor geography. Let's just talk about what is labor geography, because this, applying this labor geography framework, especially in the Indian context, is not all that, it's just coming up. So let's have a small discussion on what is labor geography. So according to Harrod, while economic geography has made important early efforts to theorize how the geography of capitalism is made, much of this work has been rather capital-centric, focusing upon the actions of collective capital to understand the making of industrial landscapes and economic geographies. So based on this, during 90s, a growing number of geographers came up with the argument that capital alone is not responsible for making their landscapes. Workers too must develop their own spatial fixes, which may be quite different from those of capital, as they seek to secure their economic and political goals, which differ significantly from that of capital. This is what framed the foundation of labor geography. Now, coming to conceptual clarification, we can see that while geography of capital talks about labor as rather peripheral to the explanations of geography of capitalism, labor geography focuses principally on the activities of working class people and an attempt to understand the geography of capitalism from their perspectives. And they argue that workers are proactive agents of change as they actively produce economic spaces and scales in particular ways. Thus, with this introduction of the central conceptual framework, that is labor geography, let me now move on to the discussing settings of this work, and then the chief methodology of my research. So this research is set entirely in Kerala, and Kerala is chosen as an arena for the inquiry of this sort due to both historical and contemporary reasons. So from the very inception and for a few decades thereafter, working class were at the center of politics in Kerala. Notably, unions in Kerala proliferated not only among formal and organized public sector workers, but also among workers employed on casual or semi-permanent basis among small-scale sweatshop-style manufacturing workers and even among self-employed. So Kerala's informal sector was typical of other Indian states with agriculture workers' dominance, but its speciality was the existence of state-specific informal sectors like toddy tapping, coir, cashew, etc. So a high degree of unionization and mobilization among Kerala's informal sector was laid to be quite exceptional in the Indian context. So this framework even suggested that Kerala was a lesson on how lower class mobilization could in effect be the engine of democratic development. So hence the processes of unionization in Kerala, which had begun in the early 1930s, has been a remarkable achievement as it gave workers, especially in rural areas, a distinct identity of their own as a part of collective organization. But a closer look at Kerala's labor mobilization history, let me say about 50 years of this labor mobilization history experience shows that Kerala's labor scenario has completely changed through the second half of 20th century. As much as Kerala bore witness to the developmental impact of an organized working class, studies have also shown that it underscores the limitations of labor militancy and redistributive strategies of development. This criticism gained more currency in the subsequent 2 decades, which severely affected the investment and thus the employment in the state. So Kerala's disappointing economic performance was largely attributed to the strength of militant trade union movements. It has been widely noted in the literature that investors were shying away from Kerala on account of higher wages and increased labor militancy. So in such a situation, the response of employers or investors were to introduce the technological changes wherever possible and or shift the industry to low-wage areas, that is outside Kerala. So low economic growth was hence accompanied by weak performances in all sectors, especially agriculture and manufacturing, aggravated by fiscal crisis and increases in unemployment, particularly among educated population since the mid-1970s. So these accounts hence highlight the interesting questions and debates concerning the relationship between collective actions and economic development in Kerala. And the successive governments since 1980s became increasingly conscious of the economic crisis, were eager to adopt policies attracting new investment. So in a way, solution to Kerala's crisis often focused on neoliberal economic development and an opening up of Kerala's economy. Hence, the role of the state morphed over the decades from being provider to facilitator for industrial investment and reinventing itself as a proactive agent. So it is this depiction of this disavowal of labor politics in Kerala that sets the stage for the 4 cases in this book. Now coming to methodology, as far as the research method goes, the labor geography frameworks basically look for causality in process instead of statistical patterns in explanation, and this inclines towards gleaning qualitative information, the purpose of which is analytical and not statistical generalization. So this book also heavily borrowed from sociological, anthropological, and partially from ethnographic approaches. And the matter in this book is based on the observations of and the interview with workers. So whenever the management or firm comes into the scene, it's again give deeper explanation to the worker's story. So I have followed Buravoy's, the idea which Buravoy used in his research, that is the multi-case method. That is a series of distinct theoretically driven cases to thematize differences, not for comparison again, and the connections between local processes and the broader socio-political economic structures that shape them. So critics may come up with the question of, these cases can be biased. For bias, it certainly is, because the cases are chosen not for statistical representativeness, but for theoretical relevance. Now coming to the chief methodology, I have again, following Buravoy, I have used the extended case method as chief methodology of this book. And this is, as a definition goes, the application of reflexive science into ethnography in order to extract the accounts of real events, struggles, and dramas that takes place over space and time. So when we use reflective science, two things becomes very important. One is context. That is, while positive science calls for the distance of the observer from the object of the studies, suggesting a detachment, and to essentially provide an accurate mapping or mirroring of the world, when one attempts to overcome such gap by embracing the context, that actually leads to embracing the reality and then employing extended case method or extending reflexive methods against this positive science. Another thing is dialogue. Dialogue becomes very important. This is dialogue mainly between the theory and the narrative which we collect from the field. And it is, at another level, it is the dialogue between the researcher and the subject. So when dialogue becomes important, the researcher also, the role of the researcher is also slightly different. Not slightly, it is different from the conventional method. Here, the researcher doesn't remain just as an observer, but the researcher will be a participant. When the researcher becomes a participant, the identity of the researcher as such is important, or the positionality of the researcher as such is important. Here, the identity or the positionality of researchers comes, I focus mainly on two themes. One is my identity as a woman, and the second one, me as a researcher who shares more or less similar culture with my subject. So with this, let me go on to my 4 cases. What is the detail of these cases? Let me just mention here that these studies are undertaken not to argue that labor is successful in conquering the overarching power of capital, or not to push forward the argument that labor as an entity is becoming stronger in opposition to capital. Or I am not trying to generalize, or this book is not trying to generalize the ongoing trend in Kerala's labor market, or I'm not even trying to compare these cases, but this book tries to argue that the local identities created by globalization vary substantially, and hence calling the need for taking care of local discourses and recognize and appreciate the variety of responses from the side of labor at local level and the part these responses raise, and the need to inquire into ongoing trends from local perspective. And this in fact helps us to include various conventional and non-conventional local agencies involved in this globalization narratives and their relatives in this meta-narratives. Now, going to my cases. So, the first case, that is the case of apparel garment workers. So, in mid-2008, I was drawn towards a newspaper report of workers' strike in a local industrial apparel park, which stood apart from the proletarian struggles familiar to Kerala in its spontaneity and the remarkable presence of women. So this developed into first case in this book, the case of the apparel park, which focuses on the working lives of apparel park workers in 2 firms in export promotion industrial park. So this case goes into the details of various power structures and everyday politics of garment shop floor, which is of recent origin in Kerala. This sort of special economic zones and the apparel parks are of recent origin in Kerala. It then examines how these workers organize around a very local set of concerns and form their own association. So this formation of workers' association, as emphatically stated during one of my interviews. So these workers were telling me that we have no politics and ours is an independent worker association, and we don't want to call our association to be known as trade union. Rather, we would like to call it as workers' forum or workers' association. So this kind of, the opinion from the side of workers cannot be equated with the proletarian struggles, usually synonymous to Kerala's experience. So as this case proceeds, along with the interesting dimensions from the worker side, we can see equally interesting transformations in the labor control strategies by firm, from the recruitment of labor to even the threat of terminating their services. Now, going to the second case. The second case focuses on a prominent electronics manufacturer and utilizes an approach to labor studies which focuses on what I call local labor control regime. So the this firm's particular business model might be the first of its kind in Kerala, where the manufacturing units are shifted to villages and where, through the support of church, the unemployed and economically deprived women are being selected and trained and working eventually under the strict supervision and management of church staff. Basically, the nuns and the priests used to manage the work which was going on there. Thus, the firm carved out the strategic arrangement with the church, an actor that has been for long a highly influential player in the development experience of Kerala. So hence the interlock between religion-led patriarchy and capitalism as a result of church pivotal role is being highlighted here. So this is then followed by detailed examination of everyday life, everyday work life, which again reminds us of Foucault's factory monastery and the day-to-day resistance parts crafted by these workers. Coming to the next chapter and the third case of this book, this is a chapter focuses on the experiences of a group of women workers involved in home-based work for a food processing firm in Kerala. So while a cursory look at, these experiences passes off easily into the conventional understanding of home-based work, a deeper analysis reveals interesting aspects where membership to the state-centric civil society organization, here it is Kudumbashri, is necessary for participation in this home-based work, highly informalized home-based work. So this chapter analyzes home-based work with a theoretical lens of space and gender. So understanding the role of space in home-based work not only allows us a clearer view of the experiences in the everyday lives of workers, but also shows how they influence the social relations of gender. So this chapter hence looks at how space and gender are mutually formed and how gendered spaces are produced in the everyday work lives of female workers. So first, I attempt a geographical explanation of the formation of such gendered spaces under home-based production. Then I narrate the different ways and means through which these workers frame various response strategies by which capital and labor were finally brought to the negotiating table. Now coming to the last case, that is the case of Cochin Port, where I was looking at the female-male workers, and ports are generally, has a very long history, especially in Kerala, long history of very sort of militant trade unionism and mainstream, the workers were mainly part of mainstream political parties and trade union membership. So this chapter is about the recent experiences in the privatization of Cochin Port, one of India's premier ports. Privatization of ports and the entry of global network terminals are rather a recent phenomenon, and an account of labor response within this is rather scanty in literature. So the Cochin Port, being a recent addition into the list of privatized ports in India, has contributed a prominent episode into the continuing rendezvous of Kerala's labor with globalization. So armed with the labor geography framework, I narrated the tensions involved in the Cochin Port's recent experience, recent privatization experience, and focusing on a section of workers affiliated to private labor pools and engaged in lashing and unlashing work, and they are called general purpose Mazdoors, GPMs, who were systematically laid off following the commencement of operation of a new privately operated container terminal run by Dubai Port World. So two aspects come to focus here. First, the port being conceived as a place, not just a point in map. And the second, the experience of this section of workers in this port and their response strategies to various concerns relating to their economic future. So with this, I move on to my concluding session of this presentation and my book. So here I'll be highlighting major contributions of this book. So while thinking about contribution, one aspect is this book in a way, or my work is sort of helping the labor geography framework to expand its own geography. And the second one, when we think about the industrial relation literature as such, the contribution of this work. So though labor geography have provided insights, it still faces certain key challenges in providing a more pragmatic understanding of the geographies of workers under contemporary capitalism. For instance, if we look at agency, this approach has tended to overlook worker agency that is not articulated as collectively organized political strategy. That is, they mainly look at the politics of trade unions, that is mainstream trade unions, and they in a way overlook the non-unionized actors as opposed to this. But in my case, or in this book, we are actually focusing on this non-unionized or unconventional labor organizations or associations. And the second one is that labor geography, this framework is mainly focusing, whenever they discuss about the worker struggles or worker concerns, mainly focusing on, or I would say the challenge, main challenge or criticism it faces is that it's rather neglected certain section of workers, whether migrant workers or informal workers or women workers especially. But this work or this book mainly, as you have already seen, is focusing on women workers and especially informal workers, whether it is in special economic zones or as home-based worker, or even if you look at the male workers, that in the case of Cochin Port, there also though Cochin Port is a formalized space, workspace, we were focusing mainly on the informal section of these workers. Another thing is that the criticism, major criticism this labor geography framework faces that in a conventional sense, this has given scant attention has been given to these kinds of politics outside of English-speaking worlds. So that's why I was telling that by using this framework to analyze Kerala's labor market, in a way this book expands the whole geography of this framework as such. Now coming to the studies of political mobilization, we can see that the studies of political mobilization have suffered from an inclination towards relating success stories. Usually whenever they try to talk about labor struggles, mainly who won the battle. So labor is the winner. But here in this work, consciously, I have moved away from the success failure stories. So here the aim is not to show that the labor is the primary winner. It was basically narrating what is going on. That is one thing. Another thing is that, especially when we look at this political mobilization in the context of globalization, as globalization is the basic theme, what we can see is that the conflict may be always between the transnational capital or globalized capital and local labor. But here we were showing that it is a local capital which is in a way acting or following more or less similar strategies of global capital, and they are using more or less similar labor control mechanism. Now, as a final point to note, though there have been vast body of national and international studies on Kerala's labor, due to, we have already seen states' peculiarities, this book is probably one of the initial attempts to studying the workforce and its experience through the lens of labor geography. So, with this, let me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, any questions, comments, please?
Presentation. I'm sorry I walked in a few minutes late, so you might have said something about it. But I was just wondering how long you spent in all the sites that you enumerated. I mean, how long was your fieldwork and what kind of challenges sort of did you encounter in the different spaces that you worked in?
So I spent nearly 3 years in the field. Wow. So 3 years, but the good thing is that my field is in Kerala, so it was very easy for me to access my field sites. So in that way, I think access to field site and spending time in field was not all that difficult. And in fact, me and Anand, we were doing our field work, the same time. So we used to go for this field work, and we used to do both these our field work simultaneously. So in that way, Anand was always there with me, to as a helper or whatever. So that was also, I didn't have to go. I didn't have to contact my journeys alone during my field. Okay, now coming to, as I already mentioned, two things. That is, I would look at it from Their meetings were usually in the Communist Party or left part. I was mainly looking at the individual left-oriented trade unions, and their meetings may go on to till midnight. And though I didn't have any problem to go and talk to them, but they were not really comfortable, me being there in their party office. That's where actually Anand was very helpful. So in the last case, it was not at all easy, but eventually, and that case actually took really long. It took nearly 1 year to go and talk to them and again visit them. Eventually, it was
May I raise something? So you mentioned that the two quintessential geographical elements that you use are space and place. If through one of these case studies you could tell us a little bit about how the workers and their work contribute to the making of a particular kind of place, that might help.
Yeah. In fact, all these cases were basically looking at how do these workers make their places. So the first thing, if you look at garment, the case of garment factory workers, so this apparel park is basically a special economic zone. So a workspace were quite restricted. And then what happened was, as I mentioned, I've seen this strike which was going on at that time. And within that garment park, how do they organize these many workers and how do they organize the strike? So these were the strategies, which are the strategies in which these workers forming their association. And the strike in fact went on for 10 days. So during this 10 days, they got support from, so they know very well that they can't get any support from within the zone or the park. So they gained support from various other organizations like Kudumbashri, they were getting support. And by then some other political parties were coming to support us, something like what was going on in Munnar. So these workers, they really didn't have any affiliation to any political parties, but some political party leaders were coming forward and giving them some help. And many other civil society agents, they tried to get support from those civil society agents. So it is in this way that workers form their own place and form this sort of association and went on for the strike. And coming to the second case, so there what happens is the church is the main, church is actually controlling the labor scene there. And they were recruiting mainly Christian girls. So as long as church and the relation to religion as such has come into the scene, it is very difficult to form this sort of place or to form their response strategies. So but what these workers have done is, they have used some of these agents. So for instance, so as I mentioned in Foucault's monastery factory, the work was going on in such a way. That is, they have to enter into factory. First thing will be they have to do a prayer, thanksgiving, and and then the nuns will be coming. And so suppose if the nuns will very open to these girls, and they were telling that if you are facing any problem, do come, let's sit and talk. So there will be counseling sessions and all. So I could see that some of these workers, very young girls, so they know that they can't just leave this factory or they can't just fool around, but they use this sort of counseling sessions as a tool to get away from the shop floor. And they go and talk to these nuns. And the same way, this particular form of work, they provide something, loans, something called marriage loans. So this marriage loans, and when they, suppose during the time of recruitment itself, they will tell that, okay, we are ready to give you sort of loan, and then you can work for us, and we will take little bit from your salary. So that was another way they control this thing. But these young women, what they used to do is that, okay, even if they accept this marriage loan, and when they feel that it's enough, or we don't want to work anymore, they want to go away from this kind of work zone, and they usually help their sisters or anyone else to replace them. So that they can be away from that, but at the same time church is okay. Because you are giving, as long as you are ready to give a replacement, it is okay. And but in the case of Cochin Port, the home-based work is even more interesting, because this home-based work, what happens is the membership to Kudumbashri units was very important, because this firm was basically using the social capital, which has created thanks to this sort of the self-help group. But this women, it is the same social capital which in a way helped these women, because they are already in a group, they know each other, and it's easy for them to be together and to talk to their firm and to create their own place in that way. Because they are in a group, they are not individual workers. they used to sit in a shed near to their houses. So maybe 10 to 20 women workers, they sit together, they work, and they have an opinion about what to do. And at times what happens was earlier, this particular firm, they never provide any that is knife or any other thing, and they never help these women to build their work shed. Basically, it is the responsibility of women to make their workspace. But later, these women joined together and they told them, see, we are doing this for you, and we don't have enough space in our house, so you have to help us to provide work shed. And the work usually go on to, especially in festival season, they have to go on till, the work will go on till 10, 12, you know. And later these women came together and they told that, no, we can't work there, we will stop our work at 5. So like this, you know, these cannot be, this may find that quite, you know, compared to the conventional trade union, various, what you call the labor response mechanism, this may find very trivial. But a set of informal workers, women workers, who are not educated, and they themselves never consider themselves as workers. So these are the strategies or ways and means in which they can create their space. Yeah, just one more thing. But in the final case, it is rather interesting because there we can see a proper place formation because they already have a history of political party and support from political party. So they gain support from, try to make support from other political parties. One level. Second level, they even gain support from international trade unions. So in a way that helps them to make their own places and respond to whatever challenges they have to face. But these women workers, they don't get such a, they don't have that much. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm building on something that Azim was talking about. I think referencing when he's talking about place is...
Yeah, I was going to actually have another question, but then I
Okay.
felt that maybe there's no time.
No, I mean, I guess my question is, one of the things is that ethnographers tend to be somewhat skeptical about the terms globality and locality, right? And are constantly looking for ways in which people are reifying these terms. And so what I was interested in finding out more about is how do any one case study that you have, how does it allow us to understand how locality is produced, right? And the other kind of somewhat less well-formulated kind of query I have is that labor itself, right, in Kerala has these multiple geographies and geographical aspirations, right? Whether you look at it in terms of intra-state migration, or you look at the geographies of remittance, you look at these different kinds of movements that are constantly occurring. The church itself is a transnational enterprise, right? So what are some of these ways in which these all come together to provide a really kind of complicated understanding of locality?
So now let's start from workers. So my first 3 cases is women workers. I would say that capital actually, or the what we call management of the firms, actually tap that those labor markets where their untouched labor pool is available. That is, these women workers, they don't want to get out of their locality where they belong to. So if you take the first case, the garment workers, what happens is this garment, the family, they didn't want to, it was a sort of, quite a lot of garment workers were coming from a particular colony, where most of them are Muslim girls. So the family, they don't want these girls to go get out of where they're coming from. So this factory, what they have done is they were ready to send the transport facility. They were ready to send a bus to these workers so that these workers can come and work. So in that way, I'm not really, or this book is not really looking at those workers
certain locality or place influences labor initiatives, right? And the use of labor on the part of the firm, right? But how do workers themselves inscribe their identity and culture onto a place? How do they make the locality? Maybe another type of question, right?
Yes.
And also, in the 4 case studies that you mentioned, in my view, the first case study, the example you gave of the strike, etc., now that is really an interplay between space and the workers. Whereas the rest of the 3, to my mind, speak of the interplay between place and workers. So would you collapse the 2, space and place, or would you obviously distinguish between them?
No, at any level, I'm not collapsing these 2. In fact, I'm showing the interplay between these 2 because, well, maybe you may have to have a detailed look at the book.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe my presentation may not have clarified.
No, of course we'll talk later.
Yeah, totally later. But by local, again, let's come to the local part. These workers, at any cost, when we look at the support which they were gaining from various agents, if you look at church itself, yes, it is mainly Catholic church, but the church of that particular area, that particular parish, and that the priests who know these people and the nun who knows these people. So that's the kind of local I'm trying to imply here. Or even the civil society organization, or even the government agents, that is for the government factory workers, the interviews were conducted in the Panchayat office, Gram Panchayat office. Just to show, sort of to give the confidence or to tell them that don't worry, we are also in a way part of it. But later, only when this issue happened, these workers thought that we can talk to our board member. But then she told them, no, I have no link with this. We have just provided you space to conduct the interview. And now coming to Kudumbashree also. So Kudumbashree is a state-centric civil society organization, and these workers were actually using. In fact, if you look at the history of Kudumbashree itself, state has used Kudumbashree for its own purpose. That is, state already has used Kudumbashree, but here what we can use is, see that the local capital is also using Kudumbashree as an agent or as a, as a tool to exploit these workers. Because the local capital or this particular firm is very clear that you will get job or you can be part of our production only if you are Kudumbashree member. So I had talked to this owner and I asked them, why do you want them to be part of Kudumbashree? They were saying that these women workers, it's very difficult because this is the first time they are working. They don't know how to work and they don't know how to keep accounts. But since they are part of Kudumbashree, Kudumbashree will help them to have already given them some training regarding how to keep account, and they know how to be strict about and how to follow certain work schedule, work time and so on. So again we can see that this particular local capital, they know certain, they know where to tap. That is, that areas, these women workers are mainly married, middle-aged women. They have no other work opportunities, as the firm says. When I was talking to my workers, they were saying that actually, what other work we can? As they are actually helping us. They are actually giving us an opportunity. So in that way, the local culture they know very well, and they know where to locate and where to work. So some similar trends we can see, of course, in any other capital labor relations. But what I'm arguing is that local capital is also using similar trends and using such tools to control this local capital.
No, we have time, except that in this university, overlapping events happen. We have another meeting perhaps. So I'll have to leave because I have to go and attend the student symposium, but we have time as a body. Yeah.
So I've been trying to compare some of this with my own work, and I see strong, resonances. So what seems to be happening here, I'm going to use some of what Anil has already said. That we are talking about processes at different levels, right? And we are then trying to relate them and see which one of these affects which one in which ways, right? In some sense. So we have something like macro processes and ideologies using certain channels at differently placed levels, national, subnational and local levels, right? And then affecting real lives in some sense. Now, my question has an epistemological aspect to it and one substantive aspect. The substantive aspect first, that it is very clear that when the macro ideologies and processes, for example, the neoliberal global economic processes, they take certain conduits to reach real lives, right? And those conduits at the space or at the level that you're operating, those could be civil society organizations, these could be cultural constructions, these could be the distribution of power in a very material sense and all of that. And it's very clear that, you know, the way it takes effect at the concrete level, its nature gets changed. And that's where what you're saying makes complete sense, that locality becomes important. And there are differences in the way localities are produced in the process, right? So the question that I have is about the nature of agency, and that's where I'm stuck. Because in some sense, you see, I mean, there's little to argue that as it takes effect, it also allows people some degree of recreating their agency within the local space. You know, so some amount of space to tinker with your gender identity, some amount of space to tinker with your class identity, political identities and all of that, right? But then, does all of this allow people to go beyond what I'm tempted to call reactive agency? Because in some sense, you're reacting to something which is operating at the global level, right? But does it allow people to go beyond reactive agency? And that's what I find difficulty in my own field work, right? Farmers are making sense of it in different ways and all that, and they're tinkering with, you know, power politics and all of that at the sub-national level. But then, does it really have something very strong to say to those meta, you know, global processes and ideologies? I mean, that's a question of agency of a different kind. And that's where I think we fail as ethnographers as well, in the sense that one would then require 10 or 15 such inductively rich case studies which build upon ways in which identities sometimes, as probably the Komarovs say, misregister experience as well. For example, in this case, religion and gender misregister some of the exploitations that are inbuilt in the nature of the change, right? So, agency at two levels is where I was struggling with what you were saying.
Yeah. So, put in one sentence, there may be many factors in the making of a locality. A, what are the prime movers? And B, what is really the role of the workers' agency in the making of the locality?
And the space. I think locality, yes, I mean, I agree that they do have
place, sense of place to see.
Yes.
Geographers, they distinguish between space and place very, very sharply.
So I think at this point, maybe I have to leave my book to you and you have to read, because since it is the 4 cases, we are basically talking about all these instances. You know, how do these localities frame and how do these workers are responding at different levels, and how these local responses are at different level compared to whatever is happening in the meta-narratives or mega-narratives which are going on. Where is it basically contradicting? And what are the basic, the thread which we can see in this labor, response in all these 4 cases, which again leads to the locality, the framing of locality and spatiality. So I think I should leave that to you. Please have a look at it, and I can even send my papers. Okay? Sure. So then let's have a discussion.
Sure.
Just one, actually not so much of a question as a comment. You know, you end with, one of the saying that one of the contributions of the book is to expand the geography of the labor geography perspective. And I think perhaps you say this in the book, I think perhaps there's a really great opportunity for us to also consider what happens when you actually expand the geography of the labor geography perspective. So kind of looking at the work, for example, of Mbembe or Ventura Santos, right? Looking at any of these frameworks, what shifts so that it's not just an add and stir kind of perspective, but there's an epistemological shift that transforms when you look at the labor geography perspective from the vantage point of an apparel art together.
So one thing is that when we look at the literature which talks about industrial relation literature or
literature talks about local, capital, labor, relations. Or if you come to literature, which is talking about Kerala's labor relations and such, one is that at least I haven't come across, or I couldn't really enjoy, or I couldn't really recognize these issues from the side of work. Okay, so if you take my women workers, because there is always a tendency to look at worker response and try to link it with the mainstream worker strategies, response strategies, or mainstream trade union strategies. But so what happens is when we look at it with that lens of mainstream trade union strategies, or that lens of expected labor response strategies, many of these attempts, like what I mentioned, my women workers case in the electronics units, they just want to get out of their shop floor. So what they do, they'd ask themselves, oh, I'm undergoing a lot of stress and strain. Can I have a counseling session? Or my other panel park workers case, so when the strike was going on and they've seen that, so some political parties are coming in, so they were so scared, are they trying to hijack our attempt? We don't want to be part of that. And they have this guts, they have to come up by saying that we are not part of any political parties or political, we don't want any support from them. So such attempts are somehow, we may not notice such attempts. So this labor geography of this framework in a way helps to look at these stories from workers' angle and to give priorities or to narrate what is happening. Even if it is such a trivial thing, but try to narrate that and to put it in a framework. Because at times we don't know, that's what I faced. I didn't know how to explain all this. Because something, major criticism coming from a pure economics research institute, and people who were working with Kerala's labor market for decades, they were saying, but hey, what is there? Or even if I talk about informality and the worker space, another thing is the everyday work life of these workers. So this is what is happening in any other garment factories. So then questions like that comes. So then I have to use the tool by saying that no, each locale is specific, or each locality, you have to look at each local labor market with its specific nature or its specific characteristics. That this framework was helpful, at least in my research.
Because they don't have a sense of local, you see.
Local.
So, I mean, this question.
No, I'm not speaking directly from the economics kind of discourse, but the kind of anthropology from Iowa Ong's work on civilization on the work floor and things like that. Yes, has had a much longer history of trying to understand the production of locality.
Yeah.
That I fully agree with you. But here the problem is that in the industrial relation literature, they don't have this locality issue, locality aspect. That's where located within a specific, because we somehow assume that there is no need of defining where is it basically happening. So this is happening, we have to look at it. So that's where it is important. And from the side of the researcher who is not really an anthropologist. So that way, and we have to use another tool to represent. So it's good.
I was told in one of the conferences by an economist that, at least use your case study, but say something about the meta-narrative. I mean, does it have something to say about capitalism today? If you have a small postscript, then it makes sense. Otherwise, it's just a case study. There's nothing.
And in fact, my own presentations, the biggest issue which I always face in my institute, wherever I present, especially with those who are not really familiar with this kind of knowledge, is that, okay, they try to compare these cases. But this case is different from that, or what do you see in this case, that case? So I find it is very difficult to convince even a basic point that, see, these two are 4 different cases, and I'm just trying to narrate what is happening. It's a collage of different events which is happening in Kerala. That's even such a simple point, it is very difficult to. How can you conduct case studies which doesn't have much, or without comparison, or without making some generalization?
I mean, the Burrowan's larger point is that case studies are all connected, right? That there is no actual theoretical basis for saying that these are 4, that you